Like me, I bet you thought that when you got your glitter on for Eurovision, you'd get away from politics. No way. Switzerland won, but in the public vote, the big numbers went to Ukraine and Israel. Even in the Malmö arena, the shadow of war is hanging over Europe. Russia's remorseless assault in the Kharkiv region continues. Ukraine's president says he needs more guns, more ammunition. Israel's impending incursion into Rafah may be just hours away. America's president says it could be a step too far. And who said that students are too busy paying off their loans to make themselves a nuisance? Well, our Prime Minister claims that free speech is under threat on British campuses. David, now Lord Cameron, is the Foreign Secretary. This week he's been explaining the UK's foreign policy. There's much to do, with war in Europe and the Middle East, and a world that increasingly feels on fire. With Israeli action in Rafah, we'll ask the Shadow Paymaster General, Jonathan Ashworth, if Labour should call for a UK arms ban, and try to find out if he has confidence in the new arrival, MP Natalie Elphicke. Sally Mapstone is Vice-Chancellor of St Andrews and represents big universities across the country. We'll discuss the fine lines around freedom of speech on campus as students protest about Gaza. Plus, throughout the show, a trio of political insiders: broadcaster and journalist Andrew Marr, fellow broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and former Conservative MP Paul, now Lord, Goodman. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Everybody knows the old saying about politics being show business for ugly people. Well, this week, show business literally provided the stage for global politics. It was bad news for Britain. In the public vote organised by European broadcasters, we scored nul point. But here at home, the politicians have been putting on their own show. In a carefully choreographed parliamentary performance, the Conservative MP Natalie Elphicke defected to Labour just ahead of Wednesday's Prime Minister's questions. The early reviews were great. But by the time the show had gone on tour to Elphicke's Dover constituency on Friday, it looked as though Keir Starmer's coup was turning into the play that goes wrong. Labour MPs grumbled about their new colleagues' right-wing views. Allegations of improper behaviour began to emerge this morning. In spite of Labour's troubles, it still looks like the Tories are heading for the end of their long run in Downing Street. Rishi Sunak still reckons he can write a plot twist with a happy ending: falling interest rates, rising growth. But the polls suggest that the Tory audience has already started to walk out. Can anything bring them back? Who knows? Well, if anyone might, it's our first guest. A little earlier, I spoke to Foreign Secretary and former Prime Minister Lord Cameron. Good morning, Foreign Secretary. By the way, it's a big anniversary for you this weekend, 14 years since you became Prime Minister for the first time. You know that, don't you?
The date I was measured, actually, is December the 5th, when I became leader of the Conservative Party, because I think that was... I don't know, for some reason, that's the one I remember, the anniversary I remember the most.
We could have a discussion if we had time about which one was more important, but yeah. Let's just deal with today's politics. This morning, it's being said that the defector, Natalie Elphicke, now sitting on Labour benches, lobbied the then Lord Chancellor, Robert Buckland, on behalf of her husband, who, as you know, was convicted and spent 2 years in prison. If that is shown to be true, would that... these are allegations now. But if that was shown to be true, what should happen?
I have absolutely no idea. So I've got really nothing to add. I'm not a fan of defectors. I took over from one in Whitney, and I think it always leaves a legacy of upset and betrayal and everything else. I mean, if it's Winston Churchill and there's some enormous moment of principle where your party's changed and you feel you have to change. Then, of course, but I mean, I thought this was just, naked opportunism by Labour as much as by anything. I mean, this is quite a right-wing Conservative MP suddenly welcomed into the Labour fold, having never supported any of their policies, people or approaches. And I thought, I mean, the revealing thing is it was like a moment when people look at the Labour Party and go, well, if you don't stand for anything, then you'll fall for stuff like this. And I thought it was very revealing, actually, in that way more than anything else.
Well, OK, we'll see what our Labour guest has to say about that later. But let's talk about your portfolio, and obviously Israel and Gaza. Last week you said that this is a world more dangerous, more volatile, more confrontational than most of us have ever known. In the light of that, have you asked the Israeli government to delay their incursion into Rafah?
Well, I had a long conversation with Minister Dermer, who's the sort of right-hand man of the Prime Minister last week, where, my view is that the right answer is to try and stop the fighting by having a hostage deal, achieving a pause in the fighting, and then using that to build a sustainable ceasefire without going back to further conflict. That, I think, is the right answer, and that's what I'm always pushing on the Israelis and on everyone else. But the problem is, it goes back to Hamas. Hamas have been offered a deal which would release hundreds of prisoners from Israeli jails, that would provide a pause in the fighting to get desperately needed aid into Gaza, and they're not taking that deal. So the question really, I think, is for Hamas. Why are you allowing this suffering to go on when you could stop it now?
But you have no influence over Hamas, but you might have some influence over the Israelis, and surely an incursion into Rafah of the sort that Mr. Netanyahu talks about is, in some senses, provocative and potentially a gift to Hamas.
Well, we don't support. We've said very clearly that if for there to be a major offensive in Rafah, there would have to be an absolutely clear plan about how you save lives, how you move people out the way, how you make sure they're fed, you make sure that they have medicine and shelter and everything else. We have seen no such plan, so we don't support a major offensive
the IDF would
like
be
that.
wrong right now.
We don't support an offensive in that way. But as I say, the real pressure should be on Hamas to agree that hostage deal. The fighting could stop tomorrow.
But it would be wrong to take that offensive.
Well, that's right, without a plan to protect people. Because, of course, in Rafah, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who've moved from other parts of Gaza. So it would be extremely dangerous to attempt a major offensive in that way.
One of the issues that's arisen, partly because of America's actions, is the issue of arms sales. Last month, the Deputy Prime Minister told me that you personally receive regularly updated advice on the legality of our arms sales to Israel. Now, in the light of their recent actions in Gaza, what's the latest advice? Is it still legal?
Well, we have a rolling process which is very thorough, very detailed. It's under the Export Control Act, and we have to give that consideration, asking the crucial question, is there a clear risk that something that could be exported could lead to a serious violation of international humanitarian law? That process is ongoing. We've made two, as it were, adjudications so far, and the process is ongoing. So I can't comment on it now.
And what was the answer to that question this morning?
Well, the answer to the question will be when we reach the next stage and we get the next assessment, will be to reach a judgment on that basis. But I mean, I've said many times that I'm not content with the action Israel has taken over humanitarian aid. So they've never been given a clean bill of health because it's important that they do better on humanitarian aid. Now, there are some signs that that is happening. They have made promises about 500 trucks a day, about opening the water and fuel pipes back into Gaza, about opening Ashdod port. Some of those things they're making progress on, but not fast enough, not quick enough.
But let me just take you back to the issue of weaponry. The State Department has released a report in the last 48 hours in which they say, I'm quoting here, it says, it was reasonable to assess that Israel had used American weaponry in a way that was inconsistent with international law. President Biden has essentially pressed pause on the movement of arms to Israel. Wouldn't it be wise for us to do the same?
Well, I think America and the UK are in a totally different situation. The United States is a massive bulk state supplier of weapons to Israel, including, £1,000-pound bombs and all the rest of it. The UK provides less than 1% of Israel's weapons, and is not a state supplier. We have a licensing system, and those licenses can be closed if it's judged there's a serious risk of a serious international human rights.
The speech that you gave last week that I referred to, actually, you made the point that though we weren't in the same position as the United States in various ways, our decisions are not all looked at all over the world. Yeah. Our position is influential, and our action, symbolic as it might be, is significant. So,
if you're saying to me, why not, never mind your detailed process, which we have, and I think that's the right way to go. If you're saying to me, why not have a, political declaration now to have an immediate arms embargo? Well, I was pressed to do that a few months ago, and the very next thing that happened just a few days later was a massive Iranian attack on Israel, including 140 cruise missiles. So I don't think it would have been a wise path, and I still don't think it would be a wise path. I mean, if I announced that today, it might help me get through this television interview, but actually it would strengthen Hamas, it would weaken Israel. I think it would probably make a hostage deal less likely. So I don't think some sort of political declaration is the right answer. We should stick with our rigorous process of making sure we act within the law.
OK, let's talk about Ukraine. Overnight, we understand the Russians are making advances. We don't know at the moment exactly how significant, but this is a dangerous moment, isn't it?
It's extremely dangerous. This only underlines that this is a unjustified, illegal invasion by Putin into an independent sovereign country. And he's now, as it were, invaded it again from the north of Kharkiv. We must do everything we can to help the Ukrainians. That's why it's so essential we've given our $3 billion a year package, and we've said that that's going to go on year after year. We're encouraging others to do the same. And crucially, the work we've done to encourage the Americans to come forward with their package. I mean, it's sad that it's taken long to come, but it will make a difference. There's no doubt that American money and support and weapons will make a difference.
Let me ask you about that, because you were obviously very active on this, and the Americans, some Americans have attributed some credit to you for persuading Mr. Trump and all of that. But is that $61 billion package just too late?
Well, it would have been better if it came earlier, because there's no doubt that Ukraine was suffering in the land war, as it were. Don't forget, Ukraine was doing extremely well on the Black Sea. They've sunk now, a full quarter of the Russian Black Sea fleet, which is an amazing achievement for a country that really hardly has a navy.
But they're bunging out tens of thousands of shells a month and they don't have them. I mean, South Korea has given Ukraine more ammunition, as I understand it, than the whole of Europe.
Well, South Korea is a massive manufacturer of 155 artillery shells, but we all need to do more. That's what the UK is doing. We're leading, once again, first to do tanks, first to do anti-tank weapons, first to do long-range artillery. Now the first to say, here is a package that isn't just this year, it's next year, the year after. But the American money will make a difference, so we've got to get in there, give the Ukrainians the support they need. They have no problems. I was there the other day. Their morale is still strong. They're still inflicting appalling casualty rates on the Russians. If only the Russian people could see how many people they're losing.
Should we be leaning on other Europeans, Germans, for example?
We are, in a polite and diplomatic and sensible way. But, if other countries did all the things that the UK is doing in terms of the long-range weapons, in terms of the training and support. We've just basically got to make our strength count. I mean, together, the allies of Ukraine outrank the Russian economy 25 to 1. So we just got to make it count. That's the key. It's very frustrating because we can help the Ukrainians to hold back the Russians this year, push them back next year, and then I think you achieve the just peace that we need to see.
If I may say so, you sound a bit cross with our European allies.
I'm not. Look, we work, if you look at the Germans, actually, they have given, in monetary terms, more than almost anybody. But of course, we'd like them to go further with the long-range artillery and with the Taurus missiles. So but it's a discussion, and but I'm doing everything I can. That's the most important part of my job right now.
Mr. Putin seems to have opened up another front now in Georgia. Of course, there are demonstrations against the law being introduced by, I won't say his placeman, but one of his friends in government, which would limit free speech, which would crack down on any organisation that the government says might be a foreign agent. Is there... You said in this speech last week that we need to act now, that's the phrase you use, to protect our values. What are we doing now to act now about Georgia?
Well, we're very supportive of the Georgian people, and we have been very clear that we think this act is wrong. It's mirrored, actually, by many countries around the world that are doing the same thing, trying to close down any sort of civic space, campaigning against any foreign non-government organisation, any charity, any organisation that they don't control. It's a problem all over the world, this sort of axis of authoritarian regimes. Indeed,
and one of them is Iran. I know this sounds a little bit like a sort of tour of the world, but that's what you do, isn't it? You referred to Iran as an authoritarian regime. This week, over 100 leading figures in the cultural world, musicians, artists and writers, published a statement protesting the death sentence placed on a 20-year-old musician, Tamaj Salehi, for his songs, which are just supporting the women's movement. What are we doing to persuade or cajole or threaten the Iranians to prevent this young man being executed?
We have sanctioned over 400 people in Iran for a range of different things. We still have diplomatic relations with them, so we're able to protest at every level things that they do and say that we disapprove of, which I think is right. And in that way, with allies, we're trying to put pressure on them in every area. So, for instance, on the nuclear dossier, we're trying to work through the IAEA to try and put pressure on there. On this sort of thing, we directly communicate with them, and we use sanctions where we can.
We talk directly
to build
to
up
the
the pressure
on this.
On this particular issue, it's something I will raise with the Iranian foreign minister. Yes.
Thank you. Now let's come home. Let's be frank. You got a thumping in the local elections. I spoke to the Prime Minister last week. He was obviously pretty frustrated. He can't close the gap with Labour. Let's suppose there was some old greybeard at the cabinet table who had maybe helped John Major win against the odds in 1992, might even have led the party to a couple of election victories himself. What would that greybeard be saying to the Prime Minister now about how he gets himself out of this?
What I say, I don't have a beard, and I'm going grey, but I've still got a long way to go. I say to him, stick to the plan. I mean, I think the Prime Minister is a good man doing a great job at a difficult time. We saw last week that his economic plans are coming right, you know, with a 0.6% growth, much more than people expected, more than the IMF expected. And you've got this situation now where you can see inflation coming down. I think interest rates are going to come down, taxes are coming down, the economy is growing. And I think you've got a very clear choice opening up. And that's what happens as you get to the end of a parliament. It stops being a referendum on the government every day, and it starts being a choice between two teams. And you've got a choice now where you can see one team, the blue team, with a very clear plan to secure Britain's future with a strong economy, with growth and jobs. And then you've got a Labour Party that's just praying that people don't look at that and they sort of think about the Prime Minister that only lasted 49 days and the problems and all the rest of it. Yeah. And you could almost feel Labour desperate for the election now, because the longer actually we have between now and the election, the more you're going to see the plan is working.
Oh, do you think that you're advising him to
I'm not in charge of election timing, let me be absolutely clear. But I think he's right. He said second half of the year, and I think that's absolutely right, because things are, you can see the economic plan is working. And also I think people can see this whole issue about security, because it's not just about what's happening in other parts of the world. Right here in the UK, you see China cyber attacks, you see Iranian and Russian physical attacks. We know that security is the most important thing, and Rishi's got the policies and the team to deliver that.
OK, you're talking about a team, but actually part of the problem, and one of the reasons that Labour's probably quite keen, is they think your team captain is lacking. Let me show you something a lot of people have been talking about. Let's have a look at this.
This is the TLDR, too long, didn't read version. The world is more dangerous than most of us have ever known. But we shouldn't let the risk we face overwhelm us into inaction. We can still make a difference.
Now, all my friends have been watching this and saying to me, watch out, this bloke is after your job. Let's look at this one.
No, I'm not.
Well, let's look at this by contrast. Now, let us be honest. Let us be honest. The first clip is in a different class to the second one. Why can't he do what you do?
Well, the second is more retail, and actually I think the fact that you know pensions are going up by £900 and national insurance is coming down by £900.
I'm glad you explained what it was about, because I didn't understand what it was about.
Yeah, but you and I have a certain generation. You know, the point is, his one actually, I mean, that's what really matters. Look, what I'm doing is important, I hope, and we're trying to make sure we have security, but ultimately, that £900 off your national insurance, that £900 on your pension, a massive achievement. And I think actually Rishi explains that extremely well.
Yeah, look, the point is that the leader has to be able to communicate both the message and the mood and the feel and persuade people. And it's no particular criticism of somebody if they can't do that, but it's quite a striking contrast that people are talking about, that you seem to be able to do this very well, he doesn't. And I suppose the question that's being asked is, your back's against the wall. Is this the right man to be leading you?
Definitely. I mean, I think, you know, if you go back to when Rishi took over, he did a very brave thing, actually, when he was campaigning for the leadership of the party. He said he thought that Liz Truss's policies were wrong and would end in tears, and he wouldn't support them. And that was a very clear, you know, a very clear statement, and he was proved 100% right. And then he takes over in difficult circumstances and says, I'm going to have to make some tough decisions to turn this around. And that's exactly what he's done. And you can now see the fruits of that with the economy growing, with inflation falling and all the rest of it. So all I can say, look, I sit around the cabinet table.
All right.
I sit around the cabinet table and I see someone who's an extremely strong and clear leader.
All right. Let me just make one last attempt dealing with this. Political party, deep in trouble, a lot of scandal, divided, falling behind in the polls. You know what they do? They turn to a man who last led their party 2 decades ago and who swore he was exiting frontline politics. If you could lose a general election, maybe the Tories might need to take a leaf out of the SNP's book.
No. I am now... I'm Foreign Secretary, I sit in the House of Lords, I'm not in the House of Commons, I'm part of Rishi's team.
You could get back.
That is what I'm interested in doing, and that's what I'm going to do.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for your time this morning. Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by broadcaster and journalist Andrew Marr, fellow journalist Daisy McAndrew, and former Conservative MP Paul, now Lord Goodman. Let's start with Gaza and all of that. Daisy, Cameron's pretty clear that I think he's a bit fed up both with Israel and also with some of our allies.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I think he is on a sticky wicket. And I think when it comes to domestic politics, when you're talking about Gaza, this issue of our arms licences is an issue that's getting increasingly difficult for the government. Obviously, we know, and I'm sure we'll talk about the problems the Labour Party's facing with this issue. But this one, the arms licences, I think is the Conservative Party, the government's real problem. And I don't think he really gave clear answers about what to do. You know, saying, well, we're a small player, we're not a state supplier like the US, we're equivalent of less than 1%. All of that is kind of immaterial when it comes to the politics of issuing those licences.
Absolutely. He kept using this very, very David Cameron phrase, I'm not content. But, you know, at the same time, the Americans have gone further.
Yeah.
I was talking to David Miliband, you know, the Labour's lost leader, as it were, who's just back from New York, where he lives these days, and asking him about this. And he gave I thought, a much clearer suggestion about what needed to be done. He said what needs to be done is we need to have a complete embargo on offensive weapons and no embargo on defensive weapons. So David Cameron's point about the Iranians attacking and the importance of a missile shield, we'll support them over that, but we do not provide new bombs, new missiles and so forth for Gaza. And his point about we're pretty small in all of this, you were quite right, Trevor. You know, we may be small, but we are a voice heard around the world, and that is why this issue remains incredibly important, not just for David Cameron, of course, but for the Labour Party too. Well,
indeed, when we come to hear the interview with Jonathan Ashworth, we do discuss this question about which weapons and can you distinguish and so on. But, Paul, what did you take from it?
I think you've got to just pan the camera back for a moment and think about the wider context. So when David Cameron came in, and the atrocities in October happened, really the parties divided up very starkly. If you looked at what was happening in Parliament, Conservative MPs were predominantly pro-Israel, Labour ones more pro-Palestinian. Cameron gradually has taken a bit of the shine off that approach and been sort of more sympathetic, certainly not to Hamas, but to the Palestinian civilians. And I kind of felt, watching that he was pushing very quietly but remorselessly in the direction of sanctions, but just didn't quite want to say so yet, and was biding his time and waiting to see what would happen.
Well, it's been very interesting, because this goes all the way back to, I think, about 2010, when David Cameron was one of the very, very first Western politicians to describe Gaza as an open-air prison camp. And the Israelis have not forgot that. So he got into the job in a position where the Israelis were already highly suspicious of him. And I think he's been trying to negotiate that all the way through, not push too hard. But at the moment, we in Britain find ourselves behind the Americans. I thought we were supposed to be shoulder to shoulder with them.
It's a very interesting relationship, this, isn't it? Because Prime Ministers always have a tricky relationship with the Chancellor and with the Foreign Secretary. And some Prime Ministers are essentially their own Chancellors, and some Prime Ministers are their own Foreign Secretaries. It feels like, actually, Cameron is actually the Foreign Secretary here.
Well, in many ways, sorry to jump in, but you were teasing him earlier on, a little while ago about wanting to be, was he going to go for the Prime Ministership? In a sense, I think what Rishi Sunak has done is something extraordinarily bold, which is he has divided the Prime Ministership, and David Cameron is the Prime Minister off these shores. He's been going around, he looks and sounds like a Prime Minister, he has the authority of a Prime Minister, and yet at home, of course, he leaves it to Rishi Sunak.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we all saw him off camera this morning, and he has the demeanour of a Prime Minister. I mean, obviously, he is a former Prime Minister, but, he's not walking around ever so humble.
He's not.
He is giving off that vibe.
That is
of somebody who's rather enjoying being back in the limelight and being back in the hot seat.
It's a reverse of the Brown-Blair thing, where Blair toured the world, being Tony Blair, and Gordon Brown kind of ran domestic.
So the difference was neither of them at the time, nor indeed now, were in the House of Lords. So Rishi Sunak can bring David Cameron in knowing, despite your very charming questions to him, that he's not a threat. He's not going to be the Conservative leader. He's not in the House of Commons. And it's as though Rishi Sunak said, I've got to concentrate on getting re-elected and on the economy. I can't be dealing with all this foreign affairs. I know. I'll bring David Cameron in to do it.
He was, coming back to domestic issues, he was sort of, rather Cameron-ish about, that's all outside my bailiwick. But I think I got a hint of David is whispering in Rishi's ear, go long on the election.
We'll see a lot more of him, I'm convinced, as the general election campaign kind of steps up. And, frankly, there will be less for him to do because most people will be expecting a Labour government to come in. And we can see that he does it very fluently and persuasively. I think the sort of challenge for Rishi Sunak is, can he get into that kind of territory at all? Generally, the answer so far has been no. But I was struck when he did a Sky interview with Ed Conway earlier this week, actually how fluent he is on numbers. When you get him on the economy, he does look more comfortable. And were I Rishi Sunak, I would be wanting to debate the economy with Starmer on TV, before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, every day of the election campaign.
Yeah, he did say to me last week, why was I so obsessed with politics? I kind of want to say, we're a politics show, mate. But,
and also, you're a politician. It kind of comes with the territory.
There was a peculiar moment there. But Daisy, do you think that, Cameron was very smooth and very supportive and so on. But there is a problem. He didn't quite say at any point, Trevor, you're talking rubbish, Rishi speaks to the public and they listen. I noticed an absence of endorsement.
And of course, picking up on Paul's point, David Cameron has two electorates, or two demographies that he's addressing. It is the foreign one, the diplomatic role, and then of course the sort of the blue wall or the yellow wall, whatever you want to call it, down the south. It's those constituencies that the Conservative Party want to push him out in front of and say, look, the grown-ups are back. The sort of the comfortable pair of slippers, the Conservative Party that you sort of used to love is still around. And David Cameron has a role there. I thought it was very funny, his Natalie Elphicke response. It was sort of, Natalie who? You know?
These little people, I can't really remember who they are. But yes, you're quite right. He's basically there to speak to the burgundy-coloured, twill-trousered England. And that is the England, interestingly, that Labour at the moment think they're taking. They're really excited about those southern blue wall seats. They think that's where there's going to be a really, really big shift.
Do you think they've got any chance of winning that group back, Paul?
It's all a matter of time. I mean, at the moment, you'd have to say no. But I'm struck by the amount of commentary around that suggests that there's not all that much conviction, on the one hand, that, you know, obviously no one really believes the Prime Minister when he says we're heading for a hung Parliament. But at the same time, I catch a lot of scepticism around about a Labour landslide. And I was looking at the results of the local elections in '95, when the Tories had a dreadful year, rather comparable to this. In that, Labour got, I think, 47% of the vote. They got 35 last week. There is a difference.
But then, Paul, it doesn't really serve anyone's purpose to be banging the drum for a Labour landslide. It doesn't serve Labour's purpose to be talking that up, and it certainly doesn't serve Conservative point of view either.
It is very unusual.
But we are objective Olympian judges, uninfluenced by party political interests.
Speak for yourself.
What do you think, Andrew? Is the gap 20% or is it 9% or is it 9%?
I think as we are sitting here now, it's going to be quite a big Labour victory and not a hung Parliament. Full disclosure, I don't agree with the Sky News Thrasher Rawlings analysis, which says we're heading towards a hung Parliament based on that projected national vote for a series of reasons which I can go into at great length if you like, but I'm sure you don't want me to. But no, I think there is a sense that for the first time, you look at the press today, look at all the newspapers today, and during this period, as Labour does better and better, inevitably and rightly, the media focus is on Labour policies and their failures and what they're going to do and the gaps in policy and all the rest of it. And I think that is a virtuous part of the kind of, if you like, the fluid dynamics of politics. It naturally happens all the time. So Labour are coming under more pressure, and that is going to be the story of the rest of this year, alongside a slow and steady improvement in the economic performance that you were talking about just now.
Well, we'll see that. Just very quickly, Daisy. Will Cameron be an asset, as Paul said very briefly in the campaign?
Yes, he'll be an asset in some of the seats they're hoping and praying they won't lose, because I think they already know, the Conservative Party, that they've lost the majority of the red wall, so that concentrating on the blue wall, I think he will be an asset, yeah. OK. It is just after 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Foreign Secretary says the UK will not stop arms sales to Israel, but he said that the Israeli army would be wrong to go into Rafah. Lord Cameron said it's a dangerous moment in Ukraine, and he's encouraging allies to give more weaponry. Lots more to come this morning. In just a moment, we'll hear from Labour's Jonathan Ashworth. And then we'll take a closer look at the issue of student protests on UK university campuses with the Vice-Chancellor of St Andrews, Sally Mapstone. Well, we've been talking to the Foreign Secretary about the situation in Ukraine, and we can get the very latest on the ground there now, where there is fierce fighting. Russia's trying to take territory in the Kharkiv region, and Ukrainian forces are fighting back. Our defence and security editor, Deborah Haynes, is near the front line. Hello, Deborah. What are you seeing there now?
Good morning. Well, I'm not actually near the front line at the moment. We're in Kharkiv city, which thankfully for now isn't under Russian artillery fire. You'll remember at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, this city was one of the key targets. It managed to withstand the invasion. Russian forces came across the border here in the northeast. It shares a long border with Ukraine. They managed to take swathes of territory across this region. But then in September of that year, the Ukrainian counteroffensive pushed the Russians out, and this city had been saved. It has since then been under missile fire from the Russians, and there had been artillery strikes, drone strikes in the border region, the villages and the odd town that is close to Russia's border here in this region. But in the early hours of Friday morning, the Russian military launched a significant new new assault, reopening a new front in this war. There are battles ongoing right now across that border region, with Russia saying that they have captured 5 villages. The Ukrainian president said last night that there's fighting going on around 7 villages. We've been up there for the last 2 days, going into the town of Vovchansk, which is right there on the border. We saw absolute devastation. The centre of the town centre has been completely destroyed by these Russian strikes. Buildings just piles of rubble. While we were on the ground, we went past this 2-storey residential block that was in flames, and there was a huge crater outside the front. We spoke to residents, dazed residents still in the town, who said to me that it was pensioners living in that block. Miraculously, no one had been killed. One woman I spoke to had blood coming out of a wound in one of her legs, but she was saying that she didn't want to leave. The order has gone out to residents in these frontline villages and towns to get out, to evacuate. The local authorities say about 2,500 people so far have been evacuated, but there are still civilians in these villages. The Ukrainians have been sending in reinforcements to try to repel the Russian offensive. But all the while, this attack here on this front is stretching Ukraine's resources in the east, in the Donbass, where we've also been in the last few days. And Ukraine really needs help. It needs more weapons. People I've spoken to have said the key problem facing Ukrainian forces on both these fronts is the lack of ammunition.
Deborah, thank you very much. We've been seeing your dramatic report, actually, from Volchansk. Look after yourself. Stay safe. Let's turn to Labour now. A little earlier, I spoke to Shadow Paymaster General Jonathan Ashworth. John Ashworth, the situation in Gaza, of course, is tense. The Foreign Secretary's told me this morning that he thinks that the Israeli Defence Force should not go into Rafah, as has been indicated by the Prime Minister. Do you agree?
Well, a full-scale offensive into Rafah would be catastrophic beyond description. I think there are over 1 million people, perhaps 1.5 million people in that region, 600,000 children. We've been calling for an immediate ceasefire for some time. I strongly believe we need a ceasefire. We need international aid into the region. But I do not want to see an offensive go into Rafah. And also, let me tell you this, I certainly don't want to see British-made weapons, British-made components which are part of weapons, be used in any full-scale offensive into Rafah. So I think the government, like the Americans have, should say that they will not sell those arms for use in Rafah.
So that is the Labour position now, that you would call for a suspension of arms sales, stop export licenses for components for weapons that could be used by Israel?
We do not want to see weapons used in Rafah. Okay. And like Joe Biden has said, if that goes ahead, those weapons should be halted. And we believe that the government should adopt that position now.
But some of those weapons have already gone. I suppose what I'm asking you about is, should there now be an export ban on weapons or components of weapons to Israel from the UK?
I'm talking about weapons and components that can be used in weapons, British-made, that can be those weapons that could be used in Rafah. We do not want those weapons to be sold. So we hope the government, we're calling on we've already called on the government, as you know, to publish its legal advice more generally about arms. But just as the Americans have said, they're halting shipments and saying that shipments will not go ahead if the Rafah offensive goes ahead, as we all fear.
So to be
the
clear,
government should adopt that position.
OK, we should do it the same as the Americans right now.
The government should adopt the position. We have got to put pressure on to stop this offensive into Rafah going ahead. It will be catastrophic.
I'm just trying to get absolutely clear on this. Should we pause arms sales to Israel or not?
We should,
yes or no?
We should be pausing arms sales in order to stop to any arms that would be used in that Rafah offensive. OK.
there is an issue here about whether we actually should have the capacity, I suppose, to influence this situation. When you say we should pause arms sales on anything that could be used, it's still not entirely clear. Should we halt all arms sales to Israel, or are you saying just some arms?
No, we're talking about weapons. We do not want this Rafah offensive to go ahead. It would be absolutely catastrophic, completely catastrophic. Right? The Americans have said they are not going to hand over arms which could be used in the Rafah offensive. I'm saying that we should adopt a similar position, that we should not sell British-made weapons or components that should be used in this Rafah offensive. All right.
Your leader this week has been talking about a new policy to stop the small boats. 9,000 people have crossed already this year, despite the government giving millions to the French, recruiting hundreds more people to the border force and deploying the Coast Guard and the Navy. What is it that you're going to do that they aren't already doing?
Well, there's a number of things that we believe should be done, which don't happen now. It's why we've called for a new border security command. That's what we would introduce. It would bring together all the different crime and intelligence agencies.
There's already a committee under the Home Office which does that.
It's not in the way that we are proposing.
Yeah, because well, I'm asking you, what's new?
Well, I'm telling you what's new. We are going to bring it together. It's going to be properly coordinated, report directly to the Home Secretary. But here's the thing. We will allow what we call some of the terrorist-style laws to be used to go after people smugglers. Things like the control orders, which mean people can meet people's sort of financial arrangements, internet access, things like that can be dealt with. Using stop and search powers that should currently use for people suspected of terrorism at the borders, we should use them against people smugglers, suspected people smugglers. Getting search warrants to go into premises which we use when we're going after terrorists. We want to use similar powers to go after people smugglers. So there is legislation on the statute book which is designed, which gives the police extra powers for terrorists. We want to use that, use that legislation to give extra powers to tackle people smugglers. That's not happening at the moment. The government don't do that.
Well, there may be a reason why it's not happening. You want to use these powers against people smugglers.
Yes.
You want to break into their flats and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
The people smugglers are almost exclusively operating from French soil. So are you saying that somehow we're going to put British police officers, British spies into France to break down people's doors? How's that going to work?
Well, we have our arrangements with Europol, with France and other countries.
So are you going to send people?
Well, there's obviously issues around the jurisdictions of other
on a foreign country's soil.
There's obviously issues around the jurisdictions of other nations, quite obviously. However, you can cooperate.
It's quite a big one. It's France.
Hang on. You can cooperate cross-border by putting more of your police and associated forces into Europol to work together. That is what we want to do. But of course, when you say that it's, of course, it's an international problem, which is why you need to cooperate internationally. But you've also got to use these powers to deal with people on this side of the channel as well.
No, but the smuggling gangs aren't operating this side of the channel. They're putting people.
Well, they've contacts, obviously, on this side of the channel, haven't they?
Boats on French beaches. So let me ask.
Yeah, they put it on a French beach, and they have contacts on the other side. That's the whole point. You need to go after the contacts on this side, and you need to go after the gangs on the other side by cooperating with your European partners in Europol.
All right. Well, let's just be very practical. My colleague here, Adam Parsons, put out a report the other day in which he literally stood on the beach and he watched smuggling gangs put people in a boat. I think we can show you that clip.
That is the taxi boat that's just arrived to pick these people up. That boat is already really full, but as you can see, they're marching out through the water. Now, the reason they're doing that is they know the police can't stop them once they're in the water. But actually, there's not a police officer to be seen.
That is going to happen tonight. It's going to happen tomorrow night. It's going to happen next week. Under your plan, who is going to be there?
Is that that's on the French coast? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's
where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, exactly. But that's why you've got to have more cooperation at a Europol level with French, and that you need to have people on the coast on both sides, obviously.
But there's cooperation, but at 3 a.m. in the morning, who's going to be there?
Well, that is why we're putting, we are cooperating through Europol, and we're going to work together, and that is not happening at a sufficient level at the moment.
It does sound to me a bit like more of the same. Only you're spending 75 million pounds more.
No, it's not more of the same. It is a new approach. And secondly, why are people coming here? It's because they know if they can cross the border here, then they are then in an asylum backlog, right? When they never get dealt with. It's like a big neon flashing light saying, please come to the UK. No, I haven't. Because the fact that we have this huge backlog with people in hotels forever and ever and ever is an incentive for the smugglers to get people here. So we're going to put more staff into processing claims, more staff into a returns unit, so we can send people back who don't need to be here and deal with the backlog. That backlog incentivises the smugglers.
All right. Let's move on to what you might call Labour's broad church. This week you've got a new MP, Natalie Elphicke. If it turns out, as it's being reported this morning, that she did indeed try to lobby the Lord Chancellor on her husband's behalf, as is alleged, over the case for which he was imprisoned, you're going to have to withdraw the whip from her, aren't you?
Well, she said that is nonsense and is not her interpretation of the meeting. I mean, I obviously wasn't in the meeting, so I don't know.
OK.
If this happened at the time, why did the Lord Chancellor not raise this issue at the time through his good offices? But more broadly...
So the simple answer is, do you have complete confidence in her version of the story, and it's nothing to see here?
Well, she said it is nonsense and not her interpretation of the meeting.
You trust her. But this is a person who said as late as, I think, 10, 12 days ago, that Labour wants an open door to all immigration. You couldn't be trusted. Let me add another one here. Your shadow Foreign Secretary, having previously described Donald Trump as a, quote, racist and a, quote, Nazi sympathiser, is today all over his advisers and says, I'm quoting him, Trump was misunderstood. Is there anybody that Labour wouldn't make common cause with to win this election?
Let me make a broader point. First of all, Natalie Elphicke's defection. That in itself, I think, reveals the disintegration and decay that we're seeing in the Tory government. She defected because she was hugely, hugely disappointed and let down at the government's failure to get young people onto the housing ladder, to deal with problems in the rental market, and indeed their failure to bring order to our borders. But more broadly, Natalie Elphicke, like Conservatives across the country, are coming over to the Labour Party.
I'm asking you about the Labour Party.
That is a good thing. Look, I'm not a tribal guy. You know that. I'm not a tribal guy. Conservatives are my friends, my neighbours, my relations. I want them to vote Labour at the next general election. Many of them voted Labour for the first time in our local elections a few weeks ago, and we are working hard to win them over at the next general election.
One quality that would bring people across might be consistency. It took you 5 minutes to adopt Natalie Elphicke without any apparent due process. You've taken a year not to restore the whip to Diane Abbott, and there's no sign you're going to do that. What's so different about Diane Abbott?
Well, I hope we can resolve Diane's situation quickly. You know it's a
I'm hearing that from people who sat in that seat for weeks and weeks, possibly months.
I know. You even wrote a blog about me the last time I came on and made this comment about it being an independent process. But it is an independent process. However, I would point out there's a couple of colleagues who have been through an independent process recently and have had the whip restored. So these processes do find a resolution. I hope they can get on with it and resolve it.
John Ashworth, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Back to our panel, Andrew Marr, Daisy McAndrew and Paul, now Lord Goodman. Aside from the fact it's lovely to hear that somebody reads my blogging, Paul, this Natalie Elphicke defection, bad news for the Tories, good news for Labour?
I always thought of Natalie Elphicke as quite a right-wing Tory MP, so her progress to Labour has been quite puzzling. I think there's a medium to long-term issue for Labour here, which is in the short term, it's great having these defections. It undermines the Tories, it knocks away at their self-confidence, they run around worrying about who's going to be next. But the reaction in Labour to all this, as we know, has not been entirely positive. And if, or perhaps when, Keir Starmer wins the general election, he's going to have a lot of trouble with people who at the moment are biting their tongue and, you know, holding back what they really think about all this once he's in government.
Do you think there's a danger this could backfire, Daisy?
I think it's very interesting if you look at it from Natalie Elphick's perspective and what she's going through. Of course, we've seen in the papers today that the attack dogs are out, and there are stories saying that she acted very inappropriately talking to Robert Buckland and saying that
the
it was
former Lord Chancellor,
you know, asking him to intervene with her husband's court case. Now, why Robert Buckland chose not to make that public when she was Conservative MP, we can all assume we know exactly why. Now that she's a Labour MP, you know, the gloves are coming off. And it's also worth bearing in mind, when you do this, when you cross the floor, you put yourself in a horrible position because your own side, your new side, in her case Labour Party, hate you because of what you used to be. Your old side, the Conservative benches, hate you. Your local party, who sweated blood, sweat and tears to get you elected, hate you because you've done the dirty. Your new local party hate you because they have spent years fighting against you. So you put yourself in a really, really uncomfortable position, and then you can expect, you know, all this mudslinging in the papers.
That was really well put, Daisy. And of course, she's not going to stand again in the next election. So what's all this about? I think in terms of this morning's story, Robert Buckland saying that she tried to inappropriately influence him, that is quite serious. And you were quite right to ask Jonathan about what Labour was going to do about it. I think if there is one rule in Westminster at the moment, it is that if Robert Buckland says something and somebody else, no matter who it is, contradicts him, then Robert Buckland is likely to be right. You know, he's a straight guy, he's a good egg, and he's very, very highly respected. This is not going to go easily away. Having said all that, this is a Westminster story. I don't think many people out in the country are really noticing the Natalie Elphick story. Very interesting story in The Sun this morning that there's another 3 Tory MPs, they claim, about to defect. So if this becomes the first part of a pattern, then it'll be a much bigger story.
And actually, on those 3, they're saying that at least one of them is a former minister. And now we can expect that would be...
Anybody care to name names here?
Paul's our man for that.
Of course, this is a kind of variant, I think, on what Nigel Farage does very expertly, which is you get Farage on these programmes and you ask him, are there any Conservative MPs preparing to defect to your cause? He'll always sort of nod his head vaguely and say, well, I can't reveal any private conversations. It's destabilising, and that's what these stories are meant to do, and since we're discussing them, they're plainly doing their job.
All right, well, let's discuss on something, if I can put it this way, more substantial, and that is Labour's Rwanda plan. Andrew, could you discern what's different about their plan?
It is a bit of a beefing up, it's a rebranding, it's rebadging, it's more money, it's all of that. And to be fair, if they can get the backlog down by bringing in more case officers dramatically, and if they can have a tougher crackdown on the gangs using Interpol and MI5 and all the rest, it will have some impact. But this is all in the context of the real Labour nightmare, which is the Rwanda policy. I personally detest the Rwanda policy, but there is a possibility that as a deterrent, it will start to work. We've seen migrants moving to the Republic of Ireland. We've seen some reports of migrants wanting to go back to the continent. The LBC interviewed some people who were wanting to do that. Now, if by the time of the election there is a perception that, horrible policy as it might be, it is beginning to work in deterring people, Labour's current policy is to eradicate it on day one of a Labour government. Now, they then want to do a returns deal with the EU or with France. But that could take a couple of years. So there'll be a period at the beginning of a Starmer government where perhaps the boats start to come back again. And that is the nightmare that hangs over them.
Very quickly, Paul, that possibly makes sense of Cameron's hint, go long.
Yes, I thought David Cameron was not exactly knocking at the door of having a summer election, about which we've heard a certain amount of chatter earlier this year. I sort of think on Rwanda that one of the problems for the opponents of the Rwanda policy has always been what's the alternative? And your pressing of Ashworth this morning just showed that the alternatives are not all that easy to do.
OK, coming up, we'll take a closer look at protests at UK universities.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. Cobbles have been pulled up out and are being used as missiles to hurl at these police. Made by people who dare to challenge. Nice to see you again, Mr. Barnier. Why?
Meeting you.
Fishing does have the potential to stymie an enormous economic deal. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. What strikes you when you come to this glacier is not just the way in which the environment is changing, but the speed at which those changes are happening.
As we've heard this morning, Israel's proceeding with its actions in Rafah, part of the Gaza Strip where Palestinians have been fleeing throughout the war. It's intensified protests across the world against Israeli action, including on university campuses in the United Kingdom, leading to the Prime Minister calling in Vice-Chancellors for a Downing Street summit on the subject. Well, let's speak now to St Andrews Vice-Chancellor, who also represents Universities UK, Sally Mapstone. Good morning, Sally.
Morning.
I think you saw the Prime Minister on Thursday. What was his complaint?
The meeting on Thursday was with government, as you say, but I should say that it was also attended by representatives from the Union of Jewish Students, the Community Security Trust and the Jewish Chaplaincy, and it was good to have them along there. I wouldn't say that the Prime Minister was making a complaint. I think this was really an opportunity for universities to express the seriousness with which we're taking cases of perceived or reported anti-Semitism on campus, recognising that there has been an increase across the UK in this kind of reporting, but also, and here we did engage very closely with government, to talk about placing an emphasis on de-escalating the current situation. What we manifestly don't want to see is any kind of incidents of the sort of activity that we've seen on US campuses, which is so distressing.
Well, let's come to that in a moment. Let's come to where the line between legitimate protest and freedom of speech and so on comes. But take this for what it's worth from a former president of the National Union of Students. It's every student's right to protest and to say things that are unreasonable up to the point of idiocy, isn't it?
It's a very common phenomenon, and it's certainly one that hasn't been restricted to the past 6 to 9 months. Universities, obviously, as you rightly say, place an emphasis on freedom of expression. That's what we're about. But we're also very much about good debate, the capacity for people to disagree well. And we want to give students those opportunities. But frankly, the challenge that we have at the moment is rightly also balancing that off against unlawful harassment. And clearly, because feelings are running so highly at the moment, there is the potential for that kind of clash of approaches, if you like, to occur. And that's what universities are having to negotiate their way through at the moment. It's not easy to do that at all, as I think everybody recognises. We see this on our streets. We also see it in our universities.
To get some clarity here, I think pretty much everybody's going to agree that harassment, as you say, should be off limits. Any kind of violence should be off limits. But inconvenience and extreme opinions, aren't they part of what this kind of balance should allow?
Yes, of course they are. Nobody has the right not to be offended by something that somebody else says. But at the same time, what our Jewish students were reporting, and the Union of Jewish Students were reporting at that meeting, is actions that have made them feel unsafe, insecure, not wanting to be present on their campuses. Now, that is something that universities have to take seriously. It's our duty to create a culture where everybody feels that they can engage. It's about feeling safe, but actually it's about engaging in that kind of reasoned dialogue. What universities have been doing for months and years, and of course well before this terrible time started, is trying to bring those communities together. You mentioned that I'm at St Andrews. This is a university that has staff and students from 140 different countries in 3 square miles in northeast Fife. We see it as our responsibility really to promote that diversity and the sharing of opinions, even if people are going to need to disagree with each other.
Is there a danger here, though, that there's a perception of double standards? And what I mean by that is this, that nobody could disagree with what you've just said. But at the same time, we have a cabinet minister who, in fact, has had to apologise and pay money to an academic for essentially publicly saying that the academic was a supporter of Hamas, that her views were unacceptable, her research shouldn't be funded, and so on. Is there some sense that perhaps our government likes the rules as long as people agree with it?
Well, that sounds like a version of Chomsky's famous statement about the right to freedom of expression only being a right to freedom of expression if it also extends to people that one despises. The trouble I always have with that is the reference to despising people. I think it's about disagreeing with people, actually. I'm not going to comment on the ins and outs of the government's politics in this. What I do think really matters is the responsibility that universities have to try and create the kind of conditions in which people can come together and have dialogue and debate. And you're absolutely right to push me on the fact that that isn't easy. We're having to negotiate our way through this on the ground, and that's a world away from the statements that people who aren't having to negotiate it may want to make.
Can I just ask about one other thing, which is heading your way this week, I think? The government's going to get a report on international student numbers, and it's being said that because of their concerns about overall immigration numbers, they want to reduce the number of international students. Is that an issue for you?
It is a very big issue for us, and thank you for raising it, Trevor. International students are incredibly important to UK culture. They contribute a huge amount to universities, to the economy, to skills and jobs. And we think it would be a tragedy, calamitous not just for institutions, but actually for the UK as a whole, if the government took what would actually be quite unnecessary further action to restrict the number of international students coming into the UK.
Professor Mapstone, thank you so much for your time this morning. In just a moment, we'll see what our panel made of that. Back to our panel, Andrew Marr, Daisy McAndrew and Paul, now Lord Goodman. Andrew, the universities haven't flared up in the way they have in the United States, but there is a difficult thing going on campus, the feeling of Jewish students that they're being intimidated, that they're being, abused and so on and so forth, versus the right of students basically to say whatever they want to say.
Trevor, the two of us, you with your NUS background and me with my student background, would be absolute hypocrites if we didn't start by saying students have an absolute right to protest and make their anger and their distress felt. And I certainly feel that. It is true that the people organising the Columbia protests in the States and other university protests are now working with students in Cambridge and Oxford and other universities to try to extend the lessons there. So there is a read-over. I think there is a particular, very specific problem that universities and indeed wider society has around anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is always vile, we always loathe it. but because for so many Jews, the existence of the State of Israel is the kind of global haven. It's the kind of historic guarantee that on this small, crowded planet, there is a place they can go ultimately and be safe if we in Britain or in France or in Germany or anywhere else turn against them, as happened in the past. Because of that, anyone who suggests that the State of Israel should be eradicated or wiped off the face of the earth, which is what some of these banners and some of these slogans, and indeed some of the organisations behind the protests actually think, then that does count as anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and I feel very sorry for those like Sally Mapstone who are having to deal with this issue because, as you quite rightly say, yes, we've had protests throughout the ages at university. That's not a new thing, but what is relatively new is the influence, I think, of social media on those kids and those university students. As a mother of teenagers, I've been quite shocked at how polarising things like TikTok are when it comes to the Middle East and when it's come to this issue where there is zero respect for an opposing view, and therefore in a lot of quarters of kids there is zero respect for the Jewish people, and I'm seeing that in my home, and I'm sure that must be much louder and more prevalent in universities.
That's the really
you can understand why Rishi Sunak asked for this meeting, and you can understand from the account of it we heard what happened. But in the end, I wonder if there's a rather uncompromising answer to all this, which is that if ordinary students who don't really have a view one way or the other are not alert to this anti-Semitic miasma and try to do something about it themselves, then these problems will intensify.
Very interesting.
So you think the issue here is more one that should be handled by students? In fact, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that actually it seems to me a slightly different thing from the day before dawn of time when I was a student, when the issue of, for example, the National Front on campus was dealt with essentially by the student union and a vote of student unions. Now there seems to be much more pressure on the authorities to sort things out.
And I think that is the real problem. What we don't want, I don't think it's the job of the Prime Minister to police universities, which are free and independent institutions. And I don't think it's the job of the authorities always to resolve these things. That sort of really, really malign movement, which Daisy was talking about, from I'm really angry about what's going on in Gaza. I hate what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Therefore, I hate the Israeli government. Therefore, I hate Israel. Therefore, I want Israel to go. Israel's run by Jews. Therefore, I hate Jews. That is what has to be stopped. And that can only be stopped by debate and argument among students in universities. I think Paul's absolutely right.
Paul, on the other question that I discussed with Sally Mapstone, the position of international students, there's some reports that the number of applications from international students has dropped pretty dramatically, and that's presumably to do with the government's decision to make visas for dependents more difficult and so on. Is this wise?
Well, this all goes back to the story of Brexit and what happened after Brexit. I think very few people would have predicted that one of the consequences of Brexit was this enormous effort by Boris Johnson to allow a sort of great flow of students in. And in fact, you've had non-EU immigration burgeoning. So eventually, the point is reached where the government feels it has to do something about this. And one of the first places it looks is at international students.
But there is also an element of fiddling the figures that's coming out of this, because we all know no matter what type of voter you are worried about the number of the levels of immigration. And so you can have quite a quick, easy hit and say, oh, well, we'll eradicate a certain number of them by getting rid of some of these foreign students. I mean, it's the wrong target.
All right, we'll come back and talk more about this in just a moment. We will be back with our panel.
You know, gender-neutral toilets are a great way to protect a lot of different people, and you know, I think what we're seeing right now is the government using a distraction technique that targets trans people to distract from a flailing government. And I don't think this policy will do anything to protect anyone. There's no evidence that suggests that mixed bathrooms are inherently more unsafe than sex-segregated ones. And meanwhile, there's a lot of compelling evidence that shows that lots of people are made more unsafe by having only sex-segregated toilets. And I'm thinking about people like trans teenagers, but I'm also thinking about cis people who are gender non-conforming, who don't necessarily pass as the gender that they were assigned at birth. And, these are the people who are going to suffer when we start really policing people's sex before they go to the toilet.
It was only in the late 1800s that women could actually go out at length from their own homes, and we had to fight for those spaces. And they were only offered those because of the need for women to spend more money. So it's never been that women get what they ask for. We have to fight for it, and now we have to defend it. Now, this is about women. It's not about how people choose to identify. It's about the needs of women. And women and men, and I'm using the term there to mean male and female, use toilets differently. And the way that men use toilets, unfortunately, means that women aren't able to use those spaces in the same way. We have to sit on wet toilet seats. This is not acceptable. But that disregards the actual safety aspect of, the installation of spy cameras, which can be collected later. This happens. This is the world that women live in.
We live in a world that is non-sex segregated. We sit on trains next to each other. We sit in the theater next to each other. We sit on the tube next to each other. I've just been in Germany, and I went to a mixed co-ed sauna where everyone was nude together, and it was completely a non-issue. If you go to a queer bar in East London, toilets are labeled cubicles or urinals. It's a non-issue. And I'm not trying to say that that's like a utopian space, far from it, but it's very easy once it's done. And I would encourage Jean to come and visit a gay bar in East London and just see how it does work, because what she's worrying about are hypotheticals that aren't really bearing out in the evidence and which do end up harming more women.
Back to our panel, Andrew Marr, Paul now Lord Goodman and Daisy McAndrew. Andrew, there's always a danger that people are going to forget about Ukraine, but it is still the biggest thing.
I was really, really pleased, Trevor, to see that you were leading your bulletins this morning with the news from Ukraine. If you look across today's papers, it's always there, but it's deep down inside the papers. I think something really important, really sinister is happening in Ukraine right now. We're on the edge of a big Russian breakthrough, potentially. And if there's one thing in the news today which is going to change all of our worlds, it's that. And I fear that historians may look back at that great Congress vote, the $61 billion aid, and say, too late.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that there is so much going on behind the scenes on this, whether you talk to people around Boris Johnson, who is still banging that drum, as loud as he possibly can. He's making, a lot of interactions and interventions on that. David Lammy has been talking about this a lot and trying to do what David Cameron's already done and cozy up to Donald Trump, because, of course, we know that he is incredibly influential and was incredibly influential when it came to that new spending in Washington. And interestingly, the people around Donald Trump saying that actually David Cameron's conversation with him, where he said to Donald Trump, do you want to inherit a White House that has Russia in the ascendancy, or do you want to inherit a White House and come in where there's still a stalemate, where you could be the hero that, as you keep saying you are going to be, where you can make a real difference with Ukraine, Russia?
We've spent a slice of the programme discussing Israel-Palestine, about which there's an enormous amount of domestic noise, especially in the universities. There's almost no domestic noise of a comparable nature about Ukraine. Geographically, it's nearer, with incredibly important consequences for it. And I feel there's a certain sense, which Andrew's picked up, of sleepwalking. Yeah. We're just assuming there's a stalemate, that nothing will change, but it could, and it's very dangerous.
And a sort of fatigue
Yes.
from journalists. and so on.
I had a conversation much earlier in the war with the Russian ambassador, and at that point the Russians were doing very badly. It was when they were being pushed back again. And after the interview, he stopped me and said, "You know, Andrew, we're going to win." And I said, "Ambassador, I'm not totally sure that's the case." And he said, "Yes, we're going to win, and I'll tell you why." He said, "Because we will create a war economy, and we'll be really focused on winning it, and we will focus on it, and you people won't. You will lose interest, you will lose attention, and you won't do what's necessary." And so far, he's been proved absolutely right.
Yeah.
We'll see what the next Parliament does about that. I agree with everything that you've all said, and of course that's why we are running it. We think it's still the biggest story, actually. But let's see what our MPs might think about it in the next Parliament. Here's an interesting graphic. Here are 104 members of Parliament who have said that they are leaving Westminster. 64 of them are Conservatives. What story does that tell us, Paul?
I think when you reach what people think, rightly or wrongly, is a sort of fin de siècle period, the MPs from the governing party tend to get out, which is what happened before 97 is happening now. What I think is more interesting generally is the trend of the sort of people who are getting out. And increasingly it seems to be very senior ex-ministers. So,
for example, Nadim Zahawi.
For example, Nadim Zahawi. And I think over a long period of time, we've seen a change in the House of Commons that, you know, when Andrew and Basie and I started out, it was representatives of Labour versus representatives of capital. Now, increasingly, it's a kind of chamber of local politicians, with the party selecting more and more people with local credentials who are local councillors. And so the foreign ministers don't stay on, they go out, especially if they're Tories, to go into the private sector.
And, of course, once the election's over, that private sector, public affairs, whatever it might be, that jobs market is going to be inundated with people sending their CVs and picking up the phone.
Right.
Start now, you're ahead of everybody else. And I'm afraid that's what a lot of these Conservatives, I mean, not just the Tories, but that's what they're doing. They want to get one of those plum jobs before the market is flooded after the election.
Right.
So much for deep commitment to public service.
And there's a limited number of these very agreeable jobs, very agreeable salaries around, so you have to get in fast. Stacey's quite right.
All right, well, let's talk about how they might be able to keep their jobs if they decide to stay. We know that the party spend a lot of money. We're just going to have a bit of fun about this, what they spend money on in campaigns. You might have been watching Eurovision last night, but let's ask ourselves, which song best sums up the two men battling to get into or stay in number 10 Downing Street? And what would they want it to be to help them win the election? Well, there has actually been some actual research trying to work that out. And here are the attributes of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer: charismatic, compassionate, competent, and the rest. As you can see, the Labour leader was higher across the board, especially when it comes to being honest and human and all that. Anyway, the clever people at DLMDD and SoundOut plugged it into some whizzy machine, and they got the song that best represents them. For Rishi Sunak, here's the song.
I would be delighted to be paid a lot of money to come up with this stuff. I mean, what does take money, actually, or a bit of nerve, is I'm sure we can all remember countless examples of when a political party has used a pop song, particularly to push their leader out at party conference, and then the pop singer involved has taken to social media, absolutely infuriated that they've been associated with a politician or political. I mean, I remember Calvin Harris came out when Theresa May walked out to one of his tracks saying, "Over my dead body, does she have permission to use this?" So you do run that risk.
I think the Stones objected to Trump using "Give Me Shelter." I think it might have been.
Yeah.
But anyway, how much a leader's going to matter here, Andrew?
Hugely. There's no doubt that we're in a weird position in British politics at the moment. And by the way, if I was choosing a song for Rishi Sunak, I think it would have to be, the way the polls are at the moment, "I Fought the Law and the Law Won." But having said that, we have two leaders who have lots and lots of qualities. I mean, Rishi Sunak is the guy who goes deep into the numbers, deep into the spreadsheets, and thinks the answer is there. And Starmer's the great lawyer. Neither of them are great storytellers. Neither of them are great exponents of a better, brighter future. And I think we have a real rhetoric shortage in this country at the moment.
And razzmatazz.
We haven't even got time to play out on a song. Thank you all very much. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back with you next Sunday, 08:30.